What's up, guys? This is Kephas.
Welcome back to this series where I answer the question, which class plays best in World of Warcraft with a controller? So last time we discussed melee DPS, and this week we're going to discuss ranged DPS. And so this is assuming that you're using a controller with around 30 action buttons available for spells, and also you're not using an add-on like Gnome Sequencer, but you're just simply playing the game with a controller and trying to play the class normally. That's kind of the idea here, almost like how you would in Final Fantasy XIV. And so it's a question that I get asked a lot, and I'm trying to answer it to the best of my ability. So we're going to go through all the ranged classes now. So we're going to start things off with Beast Mastery Hunters, and I think that Beast Mastery feels very natural with a controller. It's almost like playing a third-person, action shooter in a lot of ways, except that you're not actually moving your crosshair over your target. That would be pretty cool. It's not exactly like that, but you are able to run around while using your abilities and simply just moving around, with the camera, with the right stick. It does feel pretty natural and easy to kind of navigate around while you're doing your rotation, and your rotation is pretty straightforward. You don't have a whole lot of abilities to manage with Beast Mastery, which is really cool. I mean, even with AoE, you're simply just adding in a multi-shot here and there just to keep your cleaves up, so that's not so bad. I think the big thing that might deter some people is maybe the thought of managing a pet would be intimidating, but in WoW it's really easy because you have assist, which works really well. It just your pet attacks what you attack, so that's not so bad. But also console port has a really nifty pet wheel that makes it easy to access your pet bars, so that's really cool as well. And so with a little bit of just using that, it doesn't take long to get used to that. It's pretty straightforward, and it feels very nice and natural to play a hunter Beast Mastery in this case with a controller. I mean, simply rotation management, get used to that a little bit. Simple abilities to use beast kill command, and some longer abilities like Bestial Wrath, not so bad. You don't have to have that one as much at the ready, so you have a pretty solid core rotation that you can easily fit on a couple of buttons and get comfortable with that, and then just a few longer cooldown abilities to pop in there every now and then, so it's not so bad. And then as far as utility with hunters, it's pretty simple. I mean, the big thing will be your traps, which are pretty easy to use, because you basically have default trap launcher, so you hit your trap and then the ground reticle pops up, and then you can just move that around with your right joystick and place it wherever you want, and then just press the spell again, and it's pretty easy. So if you play games with a controller, if you've played lots of games in the past, like third-person action games or whatever, or any game really with a controller, it can feel pretty natural. So I think that console port does a really good job with those complexities in making playing these classes feel very simple. So I think that in terms of range, Beast Mastery is going to be one of your best. But I think that Marksman's pretty good too. I think hunters all around are just a great class to play with a controller. Marksman's rotation, you could say maybe it's a little more complex, but again, it's not particularly large in terms of the amount of abilities that you have to manage. And so aside from that, you're looking at pretty much the same thing, where you have a pretty simple manageable rotation, and now you don't have to manage a pet, so you kind of remove that. But I'd say that the added complexity of the class maybe kind of evens out with pet management, in that regard. And then otherwise it's going to be pretty much the same. I mean, the abilities are very simple to use, very straightforward, just click and cast, so you're not gonna have any problems there, but otherwise it's going to feel pretty much the same with the controller as Beast Mastery. So yeah, it's pretty straightforward. But then we get into by far the hardest range class to play with the controller, and that is Augmentation Evoker. And that is because a lot of augmentation isn't so much about dealing damage as it is about managing your party members, with a lot of your abilities where you're casting things on fellow party members, and party member managing your party frames can be very cumbersome. And I think that's going to be the big thing that's going to make playing this class hard, because controller support isn't natural in WoW. And so console port does an incredible job though at trying to help players with this. There are some great features in console port where you can navigate your party frames, but they still do, in my opinion, feel pretty cumbersome. And that's going to be the big thing, is just trying to manage that with the controller can be a little tricky. It's not going to be as smooth as, mouse over or just cursor selection. That's going to be your big challenge. And that's going it's another reason why the healer video that we're going to do is going to be really fun, because it's going to be pretty tricky. But yeah, it kind of like, you know, a lot of like the same problems here, where just that's going to be your biggest problem is party management. But other than that, the rotation is very small. And so that aspect of it isn't so bad. You know, the actual rotation, pretty easy. You know, you do have some, you know, ground targeting things. You know, you have a unique breath ability, I think it's Breath of Eons, you know, and we're going to talk about that again with, you know, Devastation, but, you know, kind of like, you know, that can get a little bit, you know, like you gotta get used to like moving that around, because it's not just a ground reticle. It's like this long row column ability that you're kind of using. So like, you know, again, it's not necessarily harder. It's just that it works differently, and like it took my brain a minute to kind of figure that out as well. So like you do have some complexities with this class overall, just between utility and then just like, especially with augmentation, you know, party management is going to be your biggest challenge, and that's what makes it so cumbersome. And then Devastation, I don't think Devastation is nearly as cumbersome as Augmentation, but I would definitely say it's in the manageable. It's not the easiest. Like at first thought, I thought, you know, man, this is actually pretty natural with the controller, because the rotation is still fairly underdeveloped for, you know, evokers in general. And so like the rotation is pretty easy. Like, you know, even like your empowerment abilities are pretty easy to manage. You know, you can even do like the hold it down and then let it go, you know, when you're at the right empowerment. And that feels very natural with the controller, you know. And so you have a couple of those to manage. And then of course, you know, you do have deep breath, and just like with Breath of Eons, you know, where it's like, you know, just getting the ground reticle where you want it, it can be a little bit challenging, you know. So like that's going to be your big thing with like all those abilities, you know, with fire breath as well. It's just like getting it aimed where you want to use it. But other than that, like your rotation is very simple, you know, very easy to manage that aspect of it. The thing that I would say again that kind of maybe makes Devastation a little bit trickier is the nature of some of your utility abilities. And I seriously apologize because I can't remember all the names, but like you have ones where you fly around, pick up an ally, drop them in a place. Like that can get a little bit tricky to get used to with the controller. It's not that you can't do it, but it is going to take some practice, because not only do you have to like select them in the party, use the ability, but then you have a ground targeting thing where you got to put them somewhere. So like that can get, like abilities like that can get very tricky with the controller for sure. And so things like that are going to make it a little bit more tricky just with some of the utility. But as far as like, you know, like if you're just like casually playing, you know, doing open world stuff, like just, you know, whatever, it's pretty easy. Like it's actually very easy. So it just really depends with a little bit of practice. I think that like this is definitely one of those classes that like, especially like if you're going to play solo, it can feel very easy to play with the controller. But, you know, if you're doing group content, you're trying to use some of those utility effects and abilities, it can get a little more tricky. So with that being said, we move on to Frost Mage. And I'd say that Frost Mage, it's weird to say it's not just natural, because I'm so used to Frost having a very simple rotation. And, you know, Frost rotation is fairly simple, but I am going to say it's manageable, because like you do have like, you have like different things to think about with Frost, because like, you know, you do have like a little bit more in your rotation. It's not a lot though. Like the rotation is pretty easy. Like you don't have a whole lot of abilities, you know, you just have like, you know, Frostbolt, Ice Lance, and then a couple of cooldowns, right? Like that's basically what you're doing. And it's pretty straightforward there. But the big thing is like, you also have like all these utilities like, you know, Cone of Cold and Ice Nova, and like, you know, throwing those things in there where, you know, it can add a little bit more to it, you know, shifting power, you know, all these different things going on. You can tell I played a lot of Mage. I remember the abilities very a little bit better, you know. But then you have like Polymorph as well, and like so like the big thing is going to be like target management. Like if you can kind of get used to selecting the appropriate target for the right situation, like that's going to be your big thing here. But you know, it's pretty simple. I'm probably being a little bit harsh by not just saying it's natural, but I'm comparing it to some of the other classes, and I think that's why I'm kind of bringing it down a little bit, because it is a little bit more of a learning curve, especially when you add like Blizzard to the mix, which is a ground targeting reticle ability. And again, those are pretty natural once you know do it and you feel it out. It's pretty easy, but just with all that together, like, it is going to make it a little bit trickier, but that's kind of the biggest thing. I think Fire, and this is probably why I'm putting Frost in manageable, I think Fire's a little bit more natural. And the reason why is like, again, like you gotta remember, like part of this is bias for me. It's how my brain works, because like Fire feels like a combo class, like almost like you know, like you do A, B, and C. And so like for Fire, it's A is getting heating up going, and then B is when you have heating up, you hit your ability and you get hot streak going, and then C is using Hot Streak, right? And so like for some reason that feels very easy to do with the controller, like with whatever abilities that you're using. And it's like so you don't have a very large rotation at all, like a little bit more, like a little bit less even. It's weird because I feel like it's less than Frost. Maybe I'm not playing it right, but like I do, like I feel like it's a little bit less than Frost. I mean, you do have a lot of the same like things with like different utility, like obviously polymorph, like, you know, managing your target, that kind of stuff is still there. But I think that overall it's a lot easier because the rotation is a little bit simpler, a little bit more straightforward, and executing it on a controller feels a lot more natural. You do have potentially Flame Strike, you know, for AoE. That's one that you might have, and so again, that's a ground reticle thingy. But again, like it's not hard to use at all. And so I think that fire feels pretty good with a controller. Like whether maybe you're like I guess the way I'd say it is like maybe you have like A is Fireball, and then B is Flame Strike, and then C is Pyroblast or whatever, right? Or Fireball, Fire Strike, Pyroblast. I think that's the name of the abilities. And so that way you're like, you know, heating up Hot Streak, use Hot Streak, right? Like, so like that's kind of like how I think about it, and that just feels very natural in my mind with the controller, and so that's why I think it's a very easy and natural class to play. So overall, I really like Fire Mage. I like both Fire and Frost with the controller really, but I just think that Fire Mage feels a little bit more natural. Arcane though, and I'm so sorry because most of this is probably going to be my bias. I just have a hard time with Arcane, and I think that's a big reason why I have a lot of trouble playing it with a controller, because I have a lot of trouble playing it in general. It's just because like, and it's not as hard now, but there's just so many like conditionals to every single ability that it just like it confuses me. And I think that's why it's because like it's not as straightforward as Fire, you know, and it's certainly not even as straightforward as Frost. And I think that's why, like, I don't know, maybe it's not like, maybe playing it with a controller doesn't necessarily make it any more challenging. Like maybe even with a controller, it's maybe it's a little bit simpler than other classes. I don't know, but for me, because the class itself is so challenging, that's why I'm like, oh, it's hard. It's just cumbersome because the class feels cumbersome, you know? And so that's kind of my logic. And so I apologize that maybe I'm not giving Arcane a fair shake, but that's kind of where I am with it. So maybe if you have a PhD in Arcane Mage, you know, and you get it and you're comfortable playing with a controller, maybe it's not so bad. But because the class for me has just always been more challenging to like try to understand, I definitely think it's going to be one of the harder ones in general to play. And with the controller, it's also going to be kind of challenging to play. And then we get into elemental shamans, and I think that elemental shaman is on the easier end for sure, because like a lot of it depends on the build you take. But I'm gonna say elemental shaman. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in natural, because I think that elemental shaman is very straightforward, because like you don't have a lot of abilities to manage. You know, the big thing is going to be like lightning bolt or chain lightning, right? And those are kind of counterpart abilities. And so like with counterpart abilities, like what I like to do is like I'll say like lightning bolt on right trigger in A, and then chain lightning on left trigger in A, or something like that, like where the muscle memory feels very natural. Like I do something similar for both, or I say like right trigger and A for lightning bolt, right trigger B for chain lightning. So like they're right next to each other, like something like that, where it just feels very natural. And then everything else is like a pretty straightforward, simple rotation. You know, maybe a couple of abilities for like when you're moving around, like, you know, if you use like a frost shock, like when you're moving. But otherwise, it's very easy. Like even with earthquake, because you don't have to use the ground reticle version, so that makes it a little bit easier as well. And then overall, like you just don't have a lot in your rotation. As far as utility, everything's pretty easy. Like unless you're like trying to heal somebody, you know, that might be tricky. But like using totems, no big deal. Like a lot of them you can just place at your feet. If you have anything that's like a ground reticle, like there are a couple of those, you can either just, you know, use the ground reticle, or you can make a macro where it's like cast at player, you know, the name of the totem, and it'll just put it at your feet. So certain things like that can make it even easier. But overall, I just feel like that like elemental shaman is just a very easy class to play, and with a controller, it's not particularly hard at all. So next up we have balanced druids, and again, like a lot of me wants to put this in easy, like in natural, because to me it does feel natural. But I guess I'm gonna go ahead and put it in manageable, because I think there may be a little bit of a learning curve at first, getting used to it. The thing that makes this class very easy is like you basically have your eclipses, right? So you have solar eclipse and lunar eclipse. And so you have abilities that you use for solar eclipse and you have abilities that you use for lunar eclipse. And again, I like to call those counterpart abilities. And so you have if I remember right, you have Wraith, or is it Wrath? And then you have, is it Starfall? No, that's not right. But you have the AoE version, the lunar one. I'm so sorry that I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but yeah, so you have your counterpart. And so like, again, like I was saying earlier, with lightning bolt and chain lightning, you can kind of do the same thing there. And it also applies for your, spinning astral power with single target and AoE. You can kind of get it set up in a way where it feels very natural to use one or the other on a controller. And for AoE, the class is very easy to play because it just naturally, like your AoE, you don't have to like select multiple targets or anything like that. It just naturally, Starfall hits everything, which is really cool and very easy to use. I think the thing that's going to make this a little bit trickier, aside from just, switching back and forth between, lunar and solar and having those extra, little bit of complexity there, is managing your dots. I think that's going to be the big thing that kind of makes it a little bit trickier, because like you have to, select multiple targets, with your dots. But the cool thing is talents allow you to dot multiple targets with one press. So like I think Star or Sunfire will hit like 8 targets. So you don't have to use that once. That's easy. And then Moonfire will dot like 2 targets at a time, and that's also very easy. And so like in terms of that, it's a very easy class to dot things up, because you're not having to switch targets nearly as much. But switching the targets around with tab targeting or whatever, like with the controller, can be a little bit tricky, and it may not be perfect. It may not be as straightforward as like a mouse would be. But for me, I get pretty used to it pretty quickly, and you can kind of spam your targeting button, so that like you get kind of used to it to switch pretty quickly to whatever you want. But yeah, it's not flawless by any means. So that would be the big thing that I would say sets it down a little bit. But yeah, overall it's a pretty easy class to play. Utility is pretty easy to use. Like it's all pretty straightforward there. But I'd say the dots is what holds it back just a little bit. But then we get into dots. Speaking of dots holding things back a bit. That's going to be extra the case for Affliction Warlocks. And I think that Affliction Warlocks is definitely one of the more cumbersome classes to play with a controller, because it is the dot class. It's the class built around managing dots, and that's going to be your big challenge here, is switching around your targets to keep up all these dots on different targets. And there are some talents that can simplify this for sure. You have like Seed of Corruption, things like that, and different things. But overall, this is going to be your big challenge, when managing the class, just because you have to keep these up on multiple targets. And if you're doing single target, maybe it's not so bad. But overall, it is going to be a little bit trickier. Plus, you do have the technically extra complexity of managing your pet on top of that. So like all together, I'd say that it's going to be one of the more challenging classes to get used to playing with a controller. But again, just remember, it's not impossible. It's just going to take a little bit more work. So then we get into Demonology, and I think Demonology is going to be, I think that Demonology is pretty easy, honestly. Like it really, I mean, you don't have a lot of abilities to manage, and they're all pretty easy to use. Like one of my favorite things is I like to do like D-pad up for implosion. And so when I have a bunch of imps, I hit like D-pad up, and it's like I'm pointing forward and like sending my imps to just go in and explode on the target. And it just feels very natural. So that's kind of fun. Like things like that just feel like they make sense in my brain, and it just feels really easy to use. So like overall, like, with, you have your filler ability, you have your proc ability, you have your ability that consumes your soul shards or whatever. It's pretty easy. Like like the rotation itself is going to be very easy. Utility, again, it's pretty straightforward class. The big thing is going to be like, if you got to fear something, making sure that you select the right target to fear, using things like that. But otherwise, like health funnels, drain souls, like those types of abilities are all very natural to use, you know, again with the controller. So like I've never had a problem with those. So that's pretty easy as well. And again, like pet management, no big deal with the pet wheel. So yeah, you're pretty good there. And I also think that I think the destruction's pretty natural as well. Like you do have 1 dot in fairness with destruction, so maybe it's a little bit trickier because you're, you know, multi-dotting, but like overall for me it's not so bad. I think just because the class is so easy, like you really don't have a lot to do as just destruction. Like I think that's the biggest thing. So like even with like the added complexity of the dot, because the rotation is so simple, it's no big deal. Like it's just like the biggest thing will be like getting used to switching targets for your dot. That's really it. And then of course rain of fire, if you use that, you know, like that's one that you're gonna, you know, you have the ground reticle. But again, I've said it so many times, no big deal. Pet management, no big deal. So like this is actually this is one of the better classes to play because the rotation is so small. Like that's gonna be your big thing. So much of it can be passively managed, you know. So like, yeah, I think this is one of the better classes to go for just because it's so simple and relaxed and straightforward. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And then of course we have Shadow Priest, and yeah, I think Shadow Priest, I'm gonna say that Shadow Priest is managed. Yeah, I'll say it's manageable, but honestly, I'm probably being a little bit harsh. I think Shadow Priest can be pretty easy because so much of the rotation is like, it all feels very natural and easy to manage, whether you're single target or AoE, you know, so that's pretty cool. You do have dots to manage, but again, this is simplified with Misery and then furthermore with Shadow Crash, and that makes dot management super easy. But you know, there are still going to be times where you're going to have to cast Vampiric Touch, possibly on multiple targets, because like Shadow Crash is on cooldown, and so again, you're going to have to manage your dots. And then like your core rotation, again, like it's pretty easy. You don't have a whole lot, but you do have like a little bit more to manage than like some of the Warlock, you know, specs do. So there's a little bit more complexity there with like extra abilities to manage. I think that like for me personally, using Mind Spike is easier. I don't know why. I mean, I'm sure Mind Flay's fine with the controller. Like I don't think that, but like for some reason in my mind, using Mind Spike is easier. And yeah, just a little bit more straightforward there. I think the big thing here is going to be some of your utility. You know, again, because you can heal. You know, you can bubble. You know, things like that. It's like if you had to do certain things like that on a party member, that can add a little bit extra complexity to it. And I think that's partially why I'm bringing it down a little bit, because there is a little bit of that, possibly depending on like the situation that you're in. But overall, it's not super difficult. Maybe just a little bit of, you know, working out a few things and then you're good to go. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand on the ranged classes. I hope all this made sense. And again, remember, with the right amount of practice and muscle memory, any class is going to feel natural. So just keep at it, play whatever you want. Don't be super intimidated. And you know, again, if you want to play ranged DPS and you want to play with a controller, I hope this video was helpful for you. If it was, I would love to hear about it in the comments below. But with all that being said, I will see you guys on the next one.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, let me know by clicking that like button. And feel free to share it with your friends so they can enjoy it as well. And if you'd like to see more videos, you can subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to be notified as soon as new videos are posted. You can also follow me on Facebook, and if you'd like, you can support my work on Patreon. Links to all that stuff can be found in the description below. This is Kephas. Until next time.